Welcome to I'm Fine, Save Me, the show that encourages open, honest discussions centered around self-help by diving into mental health, suicide prevention, and the power of being open and putting it all out on the line. Each week, Burl has in-depth discussions with interesting people he finds online and sees how far the rabbit hole goes. Join us now with our host, Burl Stricker.
Keep talking at you.
That's better. That's better. So, Andrea, I'm saying it correctly.
Yep. Well, you can call me pretty much every variation of that name and have it right.
I don't know. We were going through the versions, and I'm like, why is there so many versions to this name?
Because it's an ethnic name.
Yes.
You know where you know where it comes from? It is.
Where does Spanish. It come from? Are you Spanish? I know you have you're Indian. Do you have Spanish in you too?
I do. I come from the Lopez Archuletas on one side of my family.
Okay. Do you speak Spanish?
Muy poquita. Very little. Very little.
So where I live, well, I'm from Texas, but I live in Oklahoma. And I've lived in Oklahoma like 15 years. But you almost have to know Spanish because, it's a big part of the population here is Hispanic and that speak Spanish. But I love the Hispanic people because, like, I've been to Costa Rica, I've been to Mexico, I don't know how many times. And I love, the Hispanic culture. So I need to learn to speak Spanish fluently, though. I don't have it. That's one of my goals in life.
Well, if that's one of your goals in life, how serious a goal is it?
Not serious enough for me to actually make huge headway in speaking Spanish fluently. So when you go to a country that speaks Spanish, you really want to learn. But then when you leave, you kind of forget about it. So being a life coach that you are, how would you suggest that I reach that goal of speaking Spanish?
Oh, well, then you need to create a partner. That would be my first suggestion. Find someone who wants to speak it also. It's an accountability buddy.
I like it.
So that you show up and make sure it's someone that you feel uncomfortable if you don't show up.
Yeah. Because
if you feel uncomfortable about not showing up, you're more likely to show up and actually do the work that takes you to get there. But the other thing is to figure out why it is you really want to, what's important about it. Because if it's not important enough, you won't do it.
I actually think you hit on a good point because, I have never really loved the word accountability. And I understand it's like a buzzword they use in business. It's a buzzword they use in many different areas. And I think what I didn't like about it, I think maybe almost a misuse of accountability, maybe a misuse of the word. Like for me, accountability, it's like if you can't be accountable to yourself, what makes you think you're going to be accountable to someone else? That's kind of where I approached it before. And part of that is like, when I'm thinking about accountability, it's like I see people like, let's say you and I are going to work out together and, there's some accountability there. You were right in what you were saying, because if you're going to show up at 6 a.m. to the gym and I'm supposed to be there too, then it's way more likely that I'm going to be there because you're there. And I see that accountability. But then on part of it, it's like, I can also see when we start to fib about it or lie about it or start to, not be honest about, our reasons for not doing it or did we do it. So I don't know. I've struggled with the word accountability, but it's creeped up a lot more in my life lately. So
it's an interesting point you're bringing up because it's a nice segue into some of the things that I teach. And you're correct in that it's been misused. I'll say it's an abused word or label. People take words and misuse them a lot, or they overuse them, or they don't really live the meaning of them, and then the word loses its punch, right?
Right.
But that's part of the reason why I suggested if you're going to do something like that, then you want to pick someone that you're really uncomfortable not showing up for, because it heightens the probability that you won't fib, right? Because you want somebody who's going to see through your BS and be like, I know what you're doing, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
so that you show up. But it's interesting in the regard of what you're saying, this discomfort about leaning on, that's what I'm going to call it, leaning on someone else to be able to do something.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that because from my culture, from my indigenous culture side, community is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Having that sense of community. And so when you have a partner, it's a community. It's not all by yourself. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it by yourself, right? In Western society, a lot of times it's almost like if you're not independent, see how I'm putting this in quotes, independent, it's almost like, well, maybe you're not tough enough. In indigenous society, it's implicitly and explicitly understood that that the community is most important, but it doesn't mean that you cannot be independent. That overlay that we have in broader society isn't there in the same way in traditional community, the way we look at it. So there's some things that's better done in community and some things that are better done on your own. Doesn't mean that you can't do it on your own. So if we bring it back to its basics, I always go, well, we forget we humans are animals too, right? And what do animals do in the winter to stay warm?
Hibernate.
Some of them hibernate, and some of them flock together.
Mm-hmm. Cattle do that.
Yep, they huddle together.
Mm-hmm.
We do the same thing when something is challenging, whether it's emotionally or mentally or physically. We do the same thing. We reach out.
I love that you're bringing up community. I've really had a lot of thoughts about that lately. In fact, a podcast or so ago, we talked about it. I was telling this guy about my experience with a friend of mine. They own quite a bit of land and they have cattle and they do farming. And they asked me to come help them move cattle. And I was so touched and just really inspired by their family, because when we showed up we were going to work these cattle, we were bringing them in, we were doctoring them, and everybody was involved. So the women were involved, the kids were involved. And one of the most influential thing about it is that everybody kind of knew their place. So somebody that might be good at documenting, the cattle and the shots that they were given, and, really documenting, the treatments that they were doing that. And some people that were good at like riding horses and bringing in the cattle, they were doing that. Everybody knew their place. You could tell that they had done this before. This was not their first time to do it. And I said it then, it's like, it's not like there was no arguments. Yes, they argued or whatever. And it wasn't this perfect scenario, but probably the most profound, part of this experience was at noon. All of a sudden we stopped and we went to grandma's house and we all sat down at the table and we all ate a meal together, including me, who was not family. And I was invited like family. And so it got me really to thinking about this community. In fact, what I said is that is like really a goal in life. It's like, I love the idea of family working together. I love the idea of not only us working together, though, but us knowing our place and us respecting that place. I think there's nothing more important than somebody like that's close to you, understanding your strengths and then understanding your weaknesses too. And maybe they're strong in that area. So when you bring up this community idea, I think that it's probably very underrated. I think that we've made it seem like a bad thing. And, back to what you were saying about independence versus like depending on a unit or a family, I'm also reminded that, and again, this is like a recent thought, is that you have to be pretty humble to be also dependent or interdependent on other people. Humble, like understanding that I'm not very good at this, so I need some help in this area. But it also shows courage to be humble, And I think whenever you were talking about that, I was like, man, that takes courage to not necessarily show complete independence, but be dependent on somebody else when you really need it.
Interdependence.
Yes, interdependence.
Are you familiar with? It's one of the 7 grandfather teachings that I work with is humility, the ability to be humble.
Yeah. Do me a favor. Would you just define in your mind what humble means?
Humble's a tricky one.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of us tend to define it as the ability to put our ego aside, right? And accept someone's help, or to accept what I'm going to call a so-called weakness. There's a reason why I'm being very precise with my words here. What we call a so-called weakness within ourselves, right?
Okay.
Perhaps that weakness, or what we view as a vulnerability, is actually allowing someone else to connect with us tighter. Maybe it's building their self-esteem, right? So sagging back, I haven't forgotten, to stick with me, sagging back to what you were saying about community, right? Our sense of community. When we don't, whether we know how to do something or not, when we don't allow others an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge or their skills, we take away from them. So if we're not self-centered, we don't bring what I would call the child ego into it. And that's what I would call it. Most of society will say, well, don't get all up in your ego, right?
Right.
Or, oh man, he or she's egotistical. But the ego at its heart, all it really is the part of us that protects us, that wants to keep us safe. But when it gets out of control, then it becomes big and says, mine, mine, mine. I want the spotlight, or I can't ask for help because I might be perceived as this or that, right?
Right.
So ultimately, one of the most courageous things we can do is to be humble, to be vulnerable. When I say humble, it's this two-way street where we may know we're very good at something, but we're not tied up in the image of looking like we know how to do it. So we can step aside and let someone else, or boost someone else into that position to build them up, right? Or conversely, the opposite, where maybe we really don't know how to do it. And you're like, teach me. I'm not good at this. And if you take the age parameters out of that, which most of us don't, and you're saying to, say, a 15-year-old, teach me how to do this, whether you're coming from the space of you already know how to do it and you're boosting them, or whether you're coming from the space of you really don't know how, what happens is that you build a stronger connection. And that's part of part of the work I do is connection, reconnection, talking about connection and reconnection, because that's part of the reason we have a huge portion of what we have in society. If we take a look at things like corporate, or if we take a look at what you're admiring about, your time on the ranch.
Right.
And I'm familiar with that, by the way. I used to work at a ranch, and I've also shown up and helped with branding and, tagging and all those 9 yards on other ranches. So I'm familiar with the scene that you've described. And there's that community. And if you do it with a family ranch, it's even tighter usually, because they've grown together doing that. So not only does every person there know their place and each other's strengths and weaknesses, but they care about each other. Oh. And they know the danger of the work they're doing. For example, if you're a group of people who are doing branding, all it takes is one wrong step and someone can get really hurt. So you're relying on each other. So you're building that rapport and connection tighter and tighter. And that's what gives us as humans meaning in life. So the ability to be humble is not just, I'll put my ego aside, or I'll be vulnerable, right? Yeah. It's a willingness to be flexible and vulnerable and open, not just allowing someone to see what we think they'll perceive as a weakness, or maybe what we perceive as a weakness. Does that make sense the way I'm putting it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what it brings to mind? It's like, and you really brought a concept to my mind as you were talking. You've heard the deal, fake it till you make it. And I'm, in the past, I've not been a big fan of fake it till you make it. But I do see that there's areas in your life where faking it till you make it makes sense. I'll give you an example. Let's say that prayer is important to you, that you really, you want to pray, you believe in God, you think that it's important. Let's say you don't feel like praying. So you fake it till you make it. And lately I've thought about, I was not a fan of repetitious prayer. I really wasn't, because I'm just we're repeating the same thing over and over again. Come on. But I've had a new thought or new light of repetitious prayer, because what if you just do not feel like praying today and you read a prayer? You're almost faking it till you make it, because the spirituality is there, the belief is there, but you just don't feel like it. In other words, your feelings don't match up with what you believe in this particular case. So you may read a prayer this morning and kind of, it's like faking it till you make it. But yet in other areas of your life, as you were talking about, it's like when you're being vulnerable and honest, it's a concept that I've preached at work, which is always ask for help. Like if you need help, ask for help instead of saying, this is what happened. It's usually after the fact. In other words, we're very, after the fact when it comes to asking for help, because I might look at one of my staff and say, okay, yesterday you didn't do this task. Why not? And they say, oh, I didn't have time. Well, what I try to get them to understand, the minute you don't have time to do what you need to do, you need to ask for help, right? But we always are retrospective in that aspect instead of immediately asking for help. So part of it is like the vulnerability to say, I don't know this, I need help. But then there's this other side, and maybe it's in a spirituality sense that it's something you really believe that you might have to fake it till you make it. What do you think?
Well, I think there's layers and layers to what you shared here. The fake it till you make it has brought a big smile, because it's brought me back, humbling back to spaces in my life. So I've never personally been a fan of that particular phrase myself. However, the caveat is, if we take the idea of faking it out of it, and understand that when we fake it till we make it, in essence, we're practicing some system to help us. This is where most of us fail, by the way. This is where most of us fail in business, in our personal lives, in our relationships, in goals and endeavors, is we don't build a system. We don't build a solid system for ourselves to maintain, to keep us in, say, if we think of mental health. Think of mental health. We don't build a system in place that'll catch us when we fall, right? So our emotions, being able to manage our emotions and direct our emotions are, like I always say, no emotion you have is wrong, right? This is what I teach. There's not a single emotion you have that's wrong. I don't care if it's complete rage. The emotion itself is not wrong. It's what we choose to do or do not do about it. So when we get to a space where the emotion itself is making the decision, we've already gone past the point of no return. But when we build systems into our life that catch us before we get there, that's when we succeed. So say you build a tight community. We'll say, extrapolate out. We'll say somebody who is struggling with episodes of rage and depression, and it cycles in and out. And in between those sessions of feeling, they're their normal selves, if you will. When they build a community of people who understand what the challenge is, when they build a system of, okay, I know when I get up in the morning, and they practice it, because you have to practice it, because you don't feel like it when you're depressed. You don't feel like it if you're in a rage. You're not going to feel like getting on your knees and praying.
Right.
You're not going to feel like meditating. You're not going to feel like going to that Tai Chi class or church or doing whatever it is with your child. If you're in one of those emotional spaces, you're not going to feel like it. But if you build the habit, the habit system of, okay, in the morning I get up, I make breakfast, I eat with the family, and I say my prayers. In mid-afternoon, I make sure I eat lunch and I go for, a 20-minute, half-hour walk just to clear my head, and I come back. At the end of the day, I have, dinner, and I do another thing where I, can spend time with myself, literally. And it can be as little as 5 minutes, but that time is critical. When we build those systems in, what happens is that we can be feeling really horrible. I really don't want to get up and face the day. I don't want to have breakfast with the family. Little Sammy's going to be over there in the high chair throwing food everywhere. And my little girl, my wife is struggling to get her out the door, but get her to school on time. And it's a stress fest. And you got the self-talk going on in your head. I'm just giving you an example, by the way. It's all made up.
Yeah.
But, you have this thing going on in your head. But when you get yourself up and you get yourself into the breakfast and you say your prayers, maybe in the middle of saying your prayer that you don't want to say your blessing for the food, you see in the process of saying the prayer, your wife's shoulders relax a little bit. She sends you this tiny little secret smile. And that's all it takes to shift that edge of anger or depression shift you away from that. That's all it takes, because that practice is there and it catches you. Say you get up, you make it through, you don't feel like doing any of those things. Nothing shifts in the morning, and you get all the way through to your lunch. You grab your lunch box and you go for a little walk. And you're feeling depressed or you're feeling angry, and you go sit by the river and you have your food.
Right.
And maybe when you're down by the river, you see someone across the river and he's homeless and he's got his tent and he's trying to he's trying to take care of himself, and you realize you're pissed off because you didn't get the paycheck, whatever week that you didn't get it, and now you're struggling to make the bills. But you realize in the process of all that anger sitting there by the river by yourself that you're not homeless. Yeah. And you find a way to come back to yourself because you've built in that system. No matter what you try to practice, okay, you have the morning check-in with yourself, the afternoon check-in with yourself, and the evening check-in with yourself. And I'm using these checks as an example of a form of system. There's all kinds of systems. A form of system that catches you, that helps you reconnect with yourself and quiet down. And most of us don't allow ourselves that space, especially if we're really busy. We make every excuse under the sun to stay busy because whatever we're dealing with is maybe too painful, or maybe we feel guilty because we take that space. But actually, if we don't build those systems and take that space, we can't actually succeed. So that fake it till you make it, when I hear that, I always think, well, that's about a system.
Yeah.
You practice that. Faking it is practicing a system to help you get somewhere. And then when you actually get that system developed into a habit, that's when you make it. Make sense?
I like you basically exchange the word or the phrase fake it till you make it for practice. Yeah. And I like it. I actually think that's a great point. I haven't thought of it that way, but I think that's a great way to say it. It's like you're practicing this. You're practicing, you've heard the word mindful. It's like you're practicing being mindful. Yeah. So that's the word, that really stood out for me. It's like practice this, That's
all it is. And we're creatures of habit. So when we build healthy habits that support us or bring us into whatever it is that we need as an individual in our human community, when we build those habits, that's really all faking it till you make it is building a habit to get you where you want to go. But when we think, it depends on where you are, and we'll use a lofty word, where you are in the echelons of our society, what words you use. If I was talking to a C-suite executive, I'd probably be talking about something like mindset, right? Yeah. But if I go talk to the guy who's earning $7-10 an hour and he's working his butt off, hanging drywall or something, he's probably going to resonate more with something like faking it till you make it, or hey bud, we need to set you up with some good habits and practice some good habits. And you see, the concept is the same, but the language you use at each level is different, right?
I like it.
And so is the performance level.
So you are a life coach. Is that what you say your job is? What would you say your job is?
A lot of people would call it a life coach. I'd say that I'm a leadership coach and or mentor. Also, I've done some consult stuff. I don't ascribe to life coach in that, and that's me being precise with words. And here's why. Who am I to tell someone else how to live their life? That's really not my purpose. Now, what my purpose really is to support people in making positive change in their life, positive growth. And I focus specifically, I've had my fingers in an array of different things, but in the last year or so, couple years, longer than that, officially in the last few years, I've focused into leadership, but I've also previously focused in education. I've focused in mental, emotional health. I've focused in, I don't want to say special needs because that isn't accurate. So most people will know what I say when I say special needs advocate, neurologically different, learning different advocate. So I've been in some different spaces, and I've also done a lot of volunteer work in some of those spaces. But I've focused in the last few years into leadership because I see our leaderships, whether it's of a small business, a family man or a woman, C-suite or political, wherever it is, I see our leadership suffering. And when my point with focusing on leadership is that when I am able to support and influence a leader, I'm able to support everyone underneath that leader. And that allows me to have a bigger impact than working with a singular individual. Yeah. Not that I'm opposed to either. I'm not. That's just my reason for focusing in on it.
How do you deal with, so I'll give you an example that might show my point is that, so I'm what they call a CrossFit coach, meaning that I went to training to become a CrossFit coach. They don't call it a trainer because they don't use those words. They use the word coach. And really what I did was initially I attended a weekend of training, and then you took a pretty hard test, and that's how you became it. And part of it was interactive training, meaning that we worked out and we did movement and, and we learned the very basics of movements and all these things. But I've had many critics of CrossFit, for example, say that doesn't make you a trainer just because you went to this weekend course. And, to me, it's like, yeah, I agree with you. I think it takes time and, effort. And so part of it also, I owned a gym and I would practice those things and I would attend other trainings, And one of the things that I've heard, like as a negative thought about, quote, and again, you've made it clear that it's not life coach, but you see this a lot on social media about life coaches. And then, in the same post, you will see an advertisement that I can attend this course and become a life coach. In fact, recently I had somebody come to me and say, hey, I'm going to be a life coach. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm going to sign up for this course and I'm going to do these things. And of course, that brings up red flags to people. It's like they think about this experience versus, the education. Yes, the education is important. It's kind of like, I can be a good football coach and never play football. I mean, it's very possible. There's lots of coaches like that. And so part of that is like what I want to dispel that because I've watched your stuff on social media, and it's like, I know it's more than that. And I know it's more than that with you. What's your thoughts on this life coach and kind of what I described? Like, it used to kind of bother me when people would say, kind of downplay my experience as a CrossFit coach, because I'm like, no, it's more than that weekend course that I took. So your thoughts?
Well, again, it's multi-layered.
I like it.
You're going to run into that a lot with me, because nothing is really as simple as we usually think it is.
Yeah.
And conversely it is. So a lot of my first thought is that when we have an emotional reaction to anything someone says about us, that's on us. That's a me issue. Like if I like if you're saying, so you're a life coach, right? And I just smiled and changed the verbiage and explained why. I have discomfort in the idea that I am over someone's life, right? I have an emotional charge in that. So I'm using this as an example. I have a reaction to that, and that like, I don't want to be responsible for someone else's life. They're responsible for that. That's not my job. So I have this real clear line there. So I have this, this reactionary response. But the bigger reaction we have, the more uncomfortable we are with something someone says to us about us. It's usually an us issue, right? Where there's something in us that goes, well, did I learn that well enough? Or does a course really qualify me? Or do I have enough experience? It comes back to, are you really confident in who you say you are, or what you say you can do? Are you really confident there? So to add to what you're saying, to move it away from the personal a little bit more, and by the way, businesses and podcasts and leaders and leadership don't have those issues. They have personal issues. Yeah. I'll say a business doesn't have a business problem. It has a person problem. There's something going on in the leadership or with the people, because when we fix those issues, the heart and core of those issues, we usually fix whatever the problem is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
But we don't like to go there because it's uncomfortable and scary, right? And it's uncomfortable and scary. So when we go to this life coach idea that you're talking about, I personally don't believe that it's the certificate that that makes a person a good one or a bad one. That's not it. It's their ability to apply the stuff that they learn. And it's also tied into an array of factors. You could take two different people and put them through the same course and have a different set of skills come out of that based on their background and their experience, their perceptions, how empathetic they are or are not. So what I always teach people is don't get hung up on the label. Remember, when you're going to see a life coach, just like when you go to see a counselor or a therapist or a doctor, remember that first time you're seeing them, you're interviewing them too. You're not just trying to get in and see them, you're interviewing them too. And there's like a set of questions you can ask to see if you're a good fit for that person and if they're actually going to be able to support you in whatever that thing is that you're working on. So you got, like, if you use life coaches as an example, there's a whole giant spectrum of different kinds of life coaches, right? Yep. That are going to help you fix this or that about your life. If I had, say, a 23-year-old say, I'm a relationship life coach. I will teach you how to make your marriage work. Mm-hmm. I've taken this course. It took me 6 months. I went through this course, and I go. And I would question it. Why? Because a 20-year-old isn't going to have the same kind of experience as a 30-some-year-old in having a relationship. Yeah. Now, what you've got to factor into that is, has that 20-year-old had a successful relationship? Yeah. And then you factor in, so you start thinking holistically. Then what you factor in is, what is the IQ and the EQ of that 20-year-old? Because some 20-year-olds actually could do that, but they would be outliers, right? So when we're talking that life coach thing, I'm like, well, don't get hung up on the label. Rather, ask the right questions of whoever you're seeking's help. Like, ask the right questions, because some can and some can't. And it's not, again, it's not a black or white, yes or no line with that, because it is based upon the personality and the ability to really show up or not show up. I have been around 25-year-olds that would take a 60-some-year-old and walk them into the ground with just sheer intellectual horsepower. Yeah. And I've also been around the absolute opposite of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think holistically, we start thinking, well, yeah, there's this life coach component. Yeah, there's this training, but where does it really rest? Right? Yeah. We ask those deeper questions. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does. Andrea, how do you keep, like, when you're working with a client, how do you keep from going? And I ask this because I really have dealt with this personally. How do you keep from going in these complete circles without ever accomplishing anything? So I've done counseling, for example, with a therapist, and I felt like we were talking about the same thing. We're going through the same stuff. It's like, it just felt like, okay. And sometimes, and this is definitely a bad thing, but it's an example of, like, sometimes I'm like, does she even remember what we talked about last time? I felt like we're just in this vicious circle, and I did not feel like that it produced results. And so, and that's what ultimately, like, made us stop, or made me stop, is like, I feel like we're just doing the same thing over and over again without producing results. How do you deal with that with your clients? Like, where you feel like that there's goals and there's accomplishments and you feel like that you're getting somewhere. How do you deal with that?
I think that's a great question and spot on. So with your permission, may I address the idea of counselors and therapists first?
Sure, absolutely. I actually wanted to know the difference you thought anyway. So that's perfect. Well, like, for example, I've worked with counselors, right, that I told you about, but also, I have a friend that is a life coach, and, he had me, at one point was going to hire a life coach. And so some people don't know the difference. What's the difference between these two? In fact, we were talking today about the fact that pastors, a lot of times, will go to them for marriage counseling, but yet, are they really qualified to do marriage counseling? Because they're a pastor, does that make them qualified? So I'm curious what the differences is in your mind between, like, should I hire a counselor? Should I hire a life coach? That is definitely a part of, like, what I would like to know your opinion, your thought, not me personally, but you get the idea.
Yeah. So I think it depends upon what you're seeking. There is a difference to my mind. One of the things I love about coaching, whether you call it life coaching, relationship coaching, leadership coaching, business coaching, whatever. One of the things I like about it, it is very solution oriented, right? It's focused on who you are now. How do you get to where you want to be? How do you feel the way you want to feel? Whatever the issue is focused on the solution. We may look at where you are or where you were to understand what the solution needs to be, but we're very, very focused on solution orientation. Whereas in therapy, it's looking back. It's looking back to see what you went through. It's kind of like you take a jigsaw puzzle piece, it's all built, right? And you take it all apart, and then you try to put it back together the right way, right? That's what therapy often feels like to me. A really, really good therapist doesn't do that. A really, really good therapist is focused on the solution, whether it's marriage therapy, addiction therapy, trauma therapy, deep trauma, whatever it is. A really good counselor or therapist will focus on the solution. They will only go back there to find the solution. They don't make you relive every moment, because what happens is that and it's not their fault, by the way. A lot of the training that therapists and counselors go through teach them to ask that question of, so how does that make you feel? How does that make you feel?
Right.
What happened here? And you wind up, especially for highly traumatized individuals, they wind up reliving that trauma in the telling of it. But if you're really present with your client, in whichever sphere you're in, if you're really present with your client, you can see when something is painful. You can hear it. And so you ask the questions that help them get to where they want to go. You don't cover it up because it's like painting over a scrape. It doesn't heal when you just paint over it, right?
Right.
It's got to heal from the inside out. And it's the same with our psyches and emotionalities, who we are. It's got to heal from the inside out. But that healing isn't, you don't take a bruise. If you have a bruise, you don't keep hitting the bruise to make the bruise heal, do you?
Right.
But in mental emotional health, a lot of our therapists are trained to keep hitting the bruise. Now, some people will take issue with that, by the way. It'll probably be a hot button.
That's good. I like hot buttons.
But I'm speaking from experience here for anyone that, that might take issue with that. I'm not just pulling that, out of my shoe. I have experience in these fields with these kinds of professionals. And so for a variety of reasons and a variety of ways. And so what I'm trying to say is that a really good one will only touch that bruise enough to understand it or help you understand it so that they can help you find the solution. One that isn't trained well enough will keep pushing on it, which makes you make this vicious circle around whatever the issue is, and you don't really get anywhere. And it's similar. It's not the same. It's similar with coaching. If you want to get people out of that circular pattern, you have to you have to first understand what the pattern is, and then find a way to disrupt it. So most people are motivated by two primary things: want, whatever the desire is, and the fear or pain of not having it.
Yeah.
So you got to figure out, are they pain oriented? Are they motivated by what they won't get or the pain of it? Or are they motivated by the carrot, right? Pain or carrot, right? You think of that proverbial donkey with the carrot dangling, when they're chasing the carrot. Some people are motivated by both, and they're tricky, and you have to figure out, well, which one do I apply where to help them get there? Some people are motivated more by thinking about what they don't have or what they can't have if they don't do. Other people are motivated by, wow, I can get this and I can do this and I can feel this way if I do these things. So understanding those components in an individual psyche is part of how you break them out of that pattern. Are they motivated by pain or pleasure? Pain or pleasure. And then once you get that locked in, then you figure out for that unique individual or group what it is that they really want, and then what their value system really is. Because if you understand the value system, then you can help them figure out where they're going and how to get there, right? And the trick with all this is, my caveat with all this, by the way, whether it's therapy or coaching, no coach or therapist should ever be telling someone what they should do. That's never our place. Our place is to hold a safe space for people to grow in and to help them find the skills and answers they need within themselves. So it's really about learning how to be a very keen listener and observer, and asking the questions that helps that person get there. So if I say, Burl or Brian, whoever I'm talking with, you need to go do this, 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 and this is what's going to make you feel better. Mm-hmm. That's terrible, right? But if I say, well, can you tell me about that? What do you think you ought to do? Well, how do you get there? And I help you, and I keep reiterating those questions in a way that individual can understand. Pretty soon, they have a map to their own success that resonates with them, their worldview, and their value system, not something I've told them. Because when we make the error of telling someone, they can't get there.
Yeah.
Because it's not theirs. An example would be business. I've had all sorts of business coaching and sales training. I've had all sorts. Yeah. I'm not the person who can go, you have to buy this or you're going to feel incredible pain. I'm just not the person who can do that, right? I can say it, but it doesn't resonate with me because it isn't where I come from. I am the person who says that wants to ask the person the question that gets into the space of realizing what they do and don't want. And if that's not my help, that's fine. Yeah. I have people I can refer them to.
You mentioned, we talked about a little bit about like leadership. You were talking about that it's not a business problem, it's a personal problem. And, and I do, that does resonate with me. And I do understand that, I've done a lot of leadership training myself. I personally have led speaking on leadership. And what I realized, whether we're talking about my personal life and my own experience, but also my experience of others, is that I believe anybody can become a leader. I've seen it where somebody who we would not consider a leader, given the right circumstances, they become a leader. I think about when I was young, very low self-confidence. I go into the military and I am at no point a leader in the military. I'm just not. I think the confidence wasn't there. In that scenario, in that situation, that my leadership skills did not come out, honestly. Maybe in certain areas, maybe. But then I take the opposite of that is whenever in the business world, I've always been the boss. I've always been a leader. And I know those are two different things. But I'm saying is that I saw those leadership really come out more in business than I did in any other area. And so whenever I'm talking to kids about leadership, I think about this kid who's very introverted, who just sits there and listens, and they think, nobody thinks they're a leader. And yet, given the right circumstances, you can see that leadership come out. And it's different for everybody. I think that they may not even search out a leadership role when it comes to the work environment, that they may be, there's a word for it, but they may be a leader in fact. In other words, of their group or whatever goes on, people may really watch what they do and listen to their opinion and those things, and their leadership comes out in that way. I think that when you're talking about, it's like you mentioned it also, it's like you can have somebody who is like sales. I love the point of sales because if I think that we have an idea of what a sales, especially if you're not in sales, you have this idea of what a salesperson look like. And some people, they automatically think used car salesman. They think these kind of salespeople who are very in your face. Brian and I were talking about before we got on the podcast, we were talking about how LinkedIn, probably one of the most annoying things about LinkedIn is that I'm constantly getting messages that are sponsored or just direct messaging about, hey, buy my stuff. And it's almost like there's no foreplay whatsoever. It's just straight, let's go get in bed. And I'm blown away that professionals would actually think that this tactic works. I'm like, what? And in fact, I'm not my proudest moment, but there's been a couple of times where people, sent me a message and it was so, out there and basically, let's just go get in bed, meaning that, hey, buy my stuff. And I don't even know these people. And I would make a sarcastic remark back to them. Again, not my proudest moment, but I know for a fact that there's all kinds of different salespeople. There's people that use different ways. Some, for me, the in your face does not work. I recently got in real estate and I you see some people that are very in your face, a lot of pressure in real estate, whereas that's not my style. But I think about that, and also leadership. It's like we have different types of leaders, and we have. I recently listened to a podcast where it was talking about that in 2022, the CEOs of all the major companies were pretty much quiet. We didn't hear any major thing from them. And actually that resonated with me too, because it's like we're used to these in-your-face CEOs of these major companies, and they were pretty much quiet, which is what I think they should be. So in your approach to leadership and sales, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, the different aspects of leadership and sales.
Well, there's no way we could cover that in a single podcast, but what I will say...
We're going to try. So true.
But what I will say is that when it comes...
You're still stuck on the skip the foreplay and the...
No, that cracked me up. No, that cracked me up because I've heard it before. And so what I will say is that what a lot of people get wrong. And so if you reframe it, the sales technique that you run into, and you're not the only one, lots of people run into this on LinkedIn and other places. Yeah. Is think of them as, if you take it back in the day when we didn't have internet, we didn't have, people had to deal with in-person, person-to-person sales. Just think of it as the juvenile salesman who is learning how to sell, because truly, when it comes right down to it, if you frame it right, very biased in this statement, if you frame it right, sales is your highest form of service.
I can see
now,
that.
If you push back against that, good. Any listeners out there pushing back against that, good. Because if you're pushing back against that statement, you're not understanding what sales is. Because sales is helping people find what they really need and want.
Yeah.
It's not about pressuring them into buying something. If you've done that, you've erred, right? It's about helping them find the solution. So it's about matching. It's about finding the client who fits whatever it is that you offer and matching that. So say for example, my mother does beadwork, right? There's no high pressure in beadwork, by the way.
I wouldn't think so.
There can't be. You can try to say, oh, one of a kind, and hike the price and all that kind of stuff. But my mom doesn't do that. But she does one of a kind beadwork, right? And the people who come to her want one of a kind, specialty type items. There's no need for a sales pitch because they're aligning. See, she does one of a kind. They want one of a kind. Boom. Yeah. Sell made. So it's the same with anything we do. So when we're pressuring people into something, the moment that there's pressure applied, we've erred. Now, if you ask somebody a question that makes them uncomfortable, that's different. So don't get it twisted. That's different. So if like, for example, in the beginning of the call, you said, so life coach. And I went, well, wait a second. I'm not qualified for that, right? There was that, for me, there was that moment of discomfort. Well, wait a second. I'm not qualified for that. But that's kind of perfect. For me, it's a growing opportunity. And it's also an opportunity to express my opinion on what that is. Like, for me, it's like, how arrogant am I to think, oh, I can fix your life. Just come to me. Pay me $500, pay me a couple thousand. I can fix this problem. That's arrogant. But if we've built a quality system that's proven, whatever it is, and we know people can use it, there's nothing wrong with going out there and offering it. But you need to have the right questions. You need to qualify the clients, right? That's what we say in sales talk. We qualify the clients. So that what that really means is we sit down with them or go visit them, whatever modality, like whatever it is you're selling, and you have a conversation with them to see if what you're offering fits their needs. And if it doesn't, then maybe you're not a good fit, or maybe you know someone who is. Just like I had one of my clients, I worked with him for, I think 6 months. And then he moved and found he didn't need my services anymore, but he was having so much emotional stuff come up from his childhood that he needed to seek a therapist. And he kept calling me his therapist. I said, no, I'm not. I am your life coach. I'm helping you find these solutions. And I did. And he went from somebody who, had really sincere issues that kept him locked where he was in his life with both addiction and depression in his business and his relationship and where he lived. And by the time he he and I parted ways, he had changed his job, was earning more, had moved, had been making healthy habits surrounding how he was dealing with his depression, had kicked his addiction, had dealt with the legalities he'd caused through that. And the only thing he had left was his relationship, which that's not what I do, right? Hence the therapist, because he's saying, Andrea, what do I do? And I'm like, well, that's not what I do. This is what I would recommend. Go find somebody. So in sales, when we don't fit, you refer them to someone who does, right? Mm-hmm. So if like, for example, if you were coming for leadership coaching, we would sit down and have a talk. And I'd go, well, Burl, why do you think you need this? And I'd listen. Yeah. Right? I would listen. So I say sales is the highest form of service, because really all you're doing is you're helping someone find a solution to their need. Mm-hmm. And when you put pressure in it, when you put force in it, what happens is that you as a seller are screaming, I don't have enough. I'm lacking something here. I don't have enough. And so you put pressure on it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I call the adolescent or the juvenile salesperson. You have to put the pressure on there. And people get stuck, right? We can, like I've said to clients, I can give you the most phenomenal skill set in the world, system in the world, but unless you actually do the work, I can't help you. That's your choice. That's your bag. I can present it. It's like with children, we use especially when we're working with learning differences or highly sensory children who are highly sensitive. We'll use something called the Ellen Sattler method. It's purchase, prepare, and present. So you purchase the food, you prepare the food, you present the food. Nowhere in there do you say you have to eat all of your food or you have to eat this or that off your plate. There's no pressure at all for the child in that. But what you have control over as the purchase, prepare, and presenter is that you choose healthy options. If your child is someone who is really, really highly sensitive, maybe they're on the autism spectrum, as an example, maybe they won't touch something like broccoli, but they'll eat crackers all day long. Right. So you'll put something like, you'll put a small handful of crackers, a bunch of broccoli, maybe some almonds, and a few slices of apples. And you don't say you have to eat all this. You just present it. And if they only eat part of it, you pay attention as the purchase, prepare, and presenter. What did they consume? How can I nudge that a little bit further to get them healthy, right? To encourage that. My son, speaking as an example, my son, when he was really little, wouldn't touch anything sticky, anything fluffy, wouldn't touch it. He had a whole bunch of sensory stuff. And so what did I do? I started baking cookies with my kids with food coloring and all sorts of decorations. And I leaned into all the things he was interested in, dinosaurs and trucks and monsters and animals. And I'd get cookie cutter shaped like them. Because even though he didn't like touching the cookie dough, he'd come over and he'd poke at it, and that's all he'd do to start off with. Now he's like right in there with everybody else because he was curious, and I let him slowly grow accustomed to it by just presenting it over and over and over again. He made the choice. I never grabbed his hand and said, you have to put your hand in the cookie dough, which is essentially what we're doing as salespeople when we say, you have to buy my product, buy my services. When we bring force into it, we're not being of service. You see? Yeah. We're being forced into it. So that's kind of my 2 cents worth. And again, like I said, I could go.
Yeah, for sure. And I did. And brought a lot. I want to make sure, you're my guest and on this podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time. I want to make sure it'd be like you being the guest in my home. I want to make sure that we've talked about anything that you want to talk about. I've asked questions or I've prompted, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that is really important to you and that you want to make sure that you bring out in this conversation?
There's 2, actually. Thank you for asking. There's 2. One of them I know from prior conversation we're aligned on. Mm-hmm. So I'll make it the second focus. The other one is something we haven't spoken on or we sort of touched upon. And that is just that I'm in my business and in my role and what I'm working to achieve both in my calling and my business, like it's personal and professional. I am looking to work with more leaders who are really wanting to step up and make a difference in the spaces of education and the medical community and politics, like leaders in politics. And so I just want to put that out there for any listeners who may be interested in some kind of collaboration or just that kind of work. The other thing I wanted to So I got my plug in there. The other thing I wanted to touch upon with you, with your permission, is I know that when we spoke previously, you talked about suicide prevention. That's a subject close to me that I didn't want I didn't want our time together to totally dismiss, because I think it's so important. And I have personal and professional reason for that. You know, when I was 17, I lost my closest friend and relative to suicide. And I also know, because I've done a lot of work with men, that men often have a harder time with it or getting help for it than women. Because, you know, you men are taught to be all strong and not talk about, you know, you're taught to not talk about what is your challenge when you actually really need to. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that or what you're doing, but I'd really like to know with your permission.
Yeah, I think so. To just give you a quick background, my grandfather committed suicide. He found out he had cancer, and he was a farmer rancher, and he went into the field, and he was afraid to go to a nursing home. He was afraid to, you know, he was dying, but he went into the field and shot himself instead of, you know, having to deal with those end of life issues and or going to a nursing home. And then my cousin committed suicide, again, very close to these people. My cousin committed suicide about 10 years ago, and really his brother also committed suicide about a year and a half ago. And so my aunt, who I'm, you know, very close to, she had 2 kids, 2 boys, and both of them committed suicide 10 years apart. There's some similarities in those two. One, they've both been drinking as when they committed suicide. So I definitely think that had an impact on, you know, the impulsiveness of them committing suicide. And also, it's not to blame the women in their life, but they were in relationships where there was very tumultuous, very, you know, these relationships. There's a lot of chaos going on in both of their lives at the time. So another way to say it, they basically committed suicide over a woman. And I think they did it impulsively. You know, in other words, it wasn't only obviously the woman's fault, but it was this relationship that's very tumultuous and, you know, and very chaotic. Myself have, of course, dealt with suicide and suicidal tendencies over the years. And so it's very dear to my heart. And it's funny you bring up the men thing. I've recently posted something to the effect that men make up like 49% of the population, but yet they make up 80% of suicides. And so I do see, I mean, one of the reasons that I do this podcast is because, you know, and I was going to kind of ask you about this, but part of it is like, I see myself as throughout time is that I've constantly tried to self-help. Like I've read more self-help books than you can imagine. I've done more counseling than than most people. And yet I felt like kind of what we were talking about earlier is this just vicious cycle that never really made a difference, you know? And so, part of it is, yes, I want to get the word out there. But also it's like, I found that prevention, we talked about this today, Brian and I did before we got on the podcast, is that I want to, I feel like that somebody like myself and yourself is like, we're undefeated. At this point, we are undefeated. And what I mean by that is that we haven't quit. I look at the history of males in my family have not been very good. I've had, whether committing suicide or dying young. And so what I feel like that in my situation, I have 3 boys myself, and I want to teach them a different way and change that idea that this is almost like a generational curse. And I know that it's not a generational curse, but also I know that I have to do something different to, my children are adults, but to be able to speak differently into their lives. And I think that the angle that I feel is important is this idea of your dad has not quit. Your dad has struggled just like everybody else. Your dad has had problems just like everybody else.
But I want to, really show to them and their life that I didn't quit, that I'm still trying, that I'm still learning, that I'm still striving to be the best version of myself. And, believe it or not, Andrea, the reason that I contacted you is for a simple reason, is because I have felt like many times in my life that I needed help, that I needed a life coach, that I needed these things. And I think that most men, particularly kind of what we talked about earlier, is they have a tendency not to ask for help, or they may not know where to get help. And I think it's one of the biggest fallacies we have in mental health is that there's this idea that it's easy to get help. And I don't believe it's easy at all to get help. I think, for example, if I was to feel suicidal at this moment, I could call, they just started this. I don't know if it's a nationwide thing or if it's an Oklahoma thing, but where you dial these 3 numbers and you get mental help from the state. If I was to do that, they'd probably, say, hey, I'm suicidal, I'm feeling this way. I think that most guys would never do that. They would never call that line because they're afraid that they would bust in the door, come lock me up, and then I'd be in a padded room. And there's a lot of misconceptions about it, but there is a lot of truth in that. And mental health is a huge struggle in our nation. I mean, you think about the school shootings and just on and on. We are in that mental health crisis, but there's this idea that it is very easily available for help. And I just find that it's not. And I feel like that actually the help comes from conversations like you and I are having. I think for me, I will take nuggets of truth and nuggets of information that you and I had, and I will really contemplate those things. And I may use some of them in the videos and things that I do, because I'm like, man, this makes sense to me. And I think that's where, it almost comes from hearing each other's story, which I've continually talked about. And I believe it or not, much respect for you, because one of the things I just wanted to hear your story. And I think that that's how you build a relationship. That's how you build a bond. And those things actually make a bigger impact on our lives than the mental health of calling a 3-digit number, or, even a lot of times counseling, or not necessarily, the mental health, the professional mental health that we strive for. I think that it's those friendships that really matter. It's kind of like back to what you were talking about accountability. One of the reasons for a while that I did not go down the same road as my cousins and my grandfather is because I had kids and I felt accountable to those kids, and those kids mattered and their lives mattered to me. And I could not imagine. I sat in the room, my cousin, a year and a half ago, he shot himself, but he didn't die for 5 days. And then, I sat in the room with his kids in the room watching him die, basically. And I think about that and I'm like, man, I never want my kids to go through that, and that can only go so far. Truthfully, that can only go so far. But for a while there, that was a big inspiration to me to figure it out, because I didn't want my kids to go through that. But also I realized you have to kind of graduate from that. You have to go on and beyond that, because it has to be more than just, I don't want to put my kids in this position, but also, and I think this comes with personal love and feeling, in other words, your personal well-being. It's like, I don't want to do this to myself. I have a lot to offer the world. I have a lot, and I think that like my cousin in that situation that I did his funeral, and my biggest message at the funeral was that, if he could see his worth, he would have never done that. And I think that a lot of times with all of us, it's like we don't see our own worth. All we see is the mistakes. All we see is the failures. All we see is that. We don't see our own worth that other people see. I mean, if something happened to me today and, people are at my funeral, I don't think there'd be thousands of people at my funeral. What I do believe is there'd be this core group of people there, and those people, my life matters to them. And there's value in that. And it's easy to forget that value yourself when you're talking about yourself. So anyway, that's kind of my story. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. So I appreciate you asking about that.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Do we have a little time?
I have as much time as you do.
Did you hear what you just did? By the way, that's part of what makes people feel valued and seen and understood, is when we give them that space, especially when rapport and connection really starts to develop. And you just did that beautifully. I want to do a slight reframe, major reframe on a couple of things. One is you talked about, and I love that you brought it up. I just love that you brought this up. So you talked about being a father to your kids, right? And then you mentioned that they were grown. So one of the things I always work with people when they go, I'm not a leader, I go, are you a parent? Because that is the first leadership position we have. And it's the closest to home and the one that has the most impact, because we're raising other leaders. Right. So for me, as an example, when I first became a parent, I was terrified. Like I did not want to repeat the patterns I grew up with. I probably have read, I don't know how many big stacks of parenting books and psychology books and early childhood. I could probably have a degree in early childhood ed if I wanted.
Right. You're an expert now.
Well, I'm not, but I can speak with experts pretty easily. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to mess up because I knew how hard it was for me to pick myself up from what I grew from. So to give you a little background on me, I grew up on a mountain at 7,000 feet elevation without electricity, phone, television, running water, internet, any of those modern conveniences, in a little 2-room log cabin with my parents and brothers. And it was, if you picture 100 years ago, that was kind of my bringing up. I didn't do homeschool, and I didn't go to regular school. I didn't learn to read until I was 9. My dad sat me down at 9 years old for 30 minutes and taught me how to read. And I know this because I timed him, because when he first offered, I said no. And he said, are you afraid I'm going to get mad? And I said, yeah, because Dad had one heck of a temper. And he says, I promise you it's easy. I won't get mad. So he took the clock off the wall and set it on the table. And that's how I know we timed it. But so, I went from someone who was uneducated, who didn't learn to read until they were 9, from a really abusive, multi-level growing up, isolated and abusive, to someone who now has, a few college degrees, a business, is a mother herself, works in leadership. And my message really for most people out there is like, if I can do, anyone can. It's not like, oh, Andrea's all that. It's like, the one thing I did that people stopped doing is the same thing you said. I did not give up.
Right.
When I fell down, and I fell hard sometimes, I got back up. And what happens is we grow as people and individuals and leaders. It's not that we stop falling down. It's that we keep getting back up. And the more we grow, the more we begin to understand how much impact we can have on others. It started for me, it started in a microcosm of I was making a difference for my siblings and my nieces and nephews.
Right.
And then later it became I'm making a difference for my children. People go, oh, your children are so lucky to have you. And I go, gosh, I'm the lucky one here, because I would be a very different person without my children, because I didn't want them to have to go through what I did. And so I did everything I could to break those family patterns that were unhealthy and keep the ones that were, right? So you move forward in that. So that not giving up is so pivotal, that the way you're sharing that. The other thing I wanted to lean into is like, you're so right about men. I built 2 years ago, and then I just didn't market it. I built a program called Healing the Male Psyche, because there's so many gentlemen that need help and they don't have safe spaces to reach out. And the other component that was really bothering me at the time was there's a lot of, at that time, I haven't actually looked into this in a little while, but at that time, there were a lot of female coaches purporting to help gentlemen, but they would get onto their little podcast or their little thing, and they'd have this low cut blouse, and the face would be all made up, and they're yanking men around, and that really upset me.
Yeah.
I went, a lot of men need a safe female presence, a safe presence to heal in, because some of the damage that's been done isn't all from a father figure. as a mother figure too. And one of my clients, in fact, that was a large portion of the work we did was just my presence alone was just fundamental for me. I'll never forget him because just my presence alone was huge to him because I wasn't calm. I didn't lose my temper. There were like all these things that I didn't think about because I'm just being me that would come out in our coaching sessions because of how he grew up and then how he repeated that pattern from his early childhood in his relationships, right? Mm-hmm. And then like most men, we're taught that saying, right? I'll always go back to that little nursery rhyme. Little boys are made of snails and puppy dog tails. You know the one, right? And little girls are sugar, spice, and everything nice. But what does that tell us about our value, right? And so I'm always saying, well, men, we have these things in our society, yes, but are they actually helpful? Are they accessible? And are the gentlemen being understood? And conversely, so same with women, each area. But you're right about the percentage rates. The other thing I want to touch upon when it came to the suicide stuff, a lot of work there, not professionally, mostly volunteer, just FYI. I forget the percentage rate right now, but I know it was like some 80 or 90% of people who have tried and failed. Mm-hmm. In the moments of their trying, say it was a bridge and they survived. On the way, they thought, what did I do?
Yeah.
Why did I do this? So
I've heard that statistic. Yeah.
Right. So what I'm working to actually point out here is that it's impulse driven.
It is, for sure.
And so when we teach ourselves and others to build habit patterns that rein in our impulse, that hone our impulse control, we actually lessen that statistic rate of trying and doing. Yeah. You understand? Are you with me in what I'm saying?
I am. Yeah. I think it's a great point.
It's important. And I've worked with people who work in these fields. And so that impulse control is huge. And then we go, that brings me all the way full circle back to, earlier in our talk today, where you talked about the faking it till you make it, right? Yeah. And I said, well, that's just building habit patterns. What we're not taught often, I find in our society, is we're not taught what I call healthy, good mental hygiene. Andrea, what's mental hygiene? We know what hygiene is. Good hygiene. We wash our hands, we keep our bodies clean, right? We know. But we don't think about things like automatic negative thoughts, right? Automatic negative programming. We don't think about that. But if we grew up in a icky situation, we have a whole program that gives us automatic negative thoughts that bring our emotionality right down, 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 down. Call them ants for short. I borrowed it from, he's a doctor. I'm forgetting his name right now. But it's his acronym, ANT, and it means automatic negative thoughts. All of us have automatic negative thoughts, some of us worse than others. People who are suicide prone tend to have more of them, and it's part of our basic programming, usually from childhood or some traumatic experience. And when we teach ourselves to catch that thought midstream and shift it to being grateful for something, like part of how I dug myself out of some of the programming that I lived through was that when I would start feeling sorry for myself, I'd go buy a meal for a homeless person, right? Or I would see if there was a place I could volunteer to help someone less fortunate. I didn't go, oh, look at me. I just went and did it because it made me feel grateful. I wouldn't even want to do it when I first started doing this, by the way. And this is way back in my 20s. I would feel so depressed that I didn't want to do anything. Mm-hmm. But I'd make myself get up and go because the process of doing moves us, which changes our physicality, changes our physiology, right? When we change our physiology and we exercise, it changes our endorphins, changes our biochemistry, right? And then when you help someone, no matter how bad a mood you're in, you can't help but feel grateful because you're more fortunate. And then when you see the difference it makes for them, it builds what we call enduring happiness. Right? That happiness sticks with us. It's not like the candy bar where we eat and the little flash of joy is gone because the pleasure's gone, right? When we actually contribute somewhere, we build what we call enduring happiness. So we put those coins in our emotional bank, right? We build these habits that build life resilience, right? Yeah. That help us stay away from those patterns. So those were the things I kind of want to just go.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a great point. It's used in addiction recovery, and if you want to recover from alcohol or addiction, then you need to help other people, and that's a big part of recovery. And basically they say, if you don't do that, you're not going to recover yourself because you need to help other people. And that's part of it. So I love the concept of it. And I think it's true. I think it's part of it's like, I don't love this word, but I realized a lot of what I was doing was self-pity too. And if you want to get out of self-pity, that's where helping other people really comes in, because you start, and you brought up the word gratitude, and it's true. Gratitude comes when you help other people, and it gets us out of that self-pity mode and it gets us in that gratitude mode. And I think that's a great deal.
An attitude of gratitude.
Yes. Okay. So how do people reach out to you, get a hold of you? How do they, I want to make sure we get your information out there, because I know somebody listening to this will be like, yep, I want to contact her, or I want to follow her. So how do they do that?
The first place I always recommend is LinkedIn, because it's my main platform where you'll find me.
Yeah.
As a platform, I do have a couple irons in the fire. I am working to pull together a book to publish. And I also am working to get a website together. I do have one. It's one of those sort of ad hoc things that is out there, and they can find me through that as well. But honestly, I'd say check out LinkedIn. If you can't find me there, check out Facebook, send me a direct message, reach out. Those are the easiest ways to find me.
I'm glad one of the last things I wanted to ask you about is LinkedIn. I think I'm talking about people that I know personally. I mean, I know I don't know you personally, but I'm saying that I follow, you actually have a great presence to me on LinkedIn. We were talking about this earlier as well, that almost every time, I'm not a big fan. I haven't been a big fan of LinkedIn. I really haven't. I've been on there forever. I just have not been a big fan. I struggle even getting any traction on LinkedIn. Believe it or not, you know what my biggest platform is? I'm going to let you guess. Social media platform. What do you think the biggest one for me is?
I'm going to say something like IG or TikTok.
TikTok. It actually is TikTok. And so but out of all the platforms, where I've struggled the most is LinkedIn. And yet every time I pull up LinkedIn, you're there almost every single time. And so I think you've done a great job of like really moving and with traction. Where Brian and I never talked about you, he's on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, we work together, and he follows you, I follow you. That's a separate event, meaning he followed you on his own, I follow you on my own. And yet there's definitely been some traction there. And you've made me actually rethink LinkedIn. In fact, we're talking about maybe doing some lives on LinkedIn, just because I would like your advice on LinkedIn. And what would you suggest for me on LinkedIn?
Well, I'd say, for my first, I would ask, what is it you're seeking? Because just like any platform, it has its pros and its cons. So the question would be like, what is it you're really wanting on there?
Yeah.
And then I could better answer that question.
Well, I think that the same thing with like awareness, like one of my big focus right now, is this podcast. I think that, we're trying to define exactly where we want the podcast to go, but it definitely is in this mental health spectrum. It is definitely in the suicide prevention. I love talking about business stuff too. I could sit here all day and talk to you about business with leadership, and I love those subjects. Part of it is I want the ability. I used to have a podcast that focused on healthcare only, and it focused on more of the long-term care kind of aspect, and it did really well. But also, it really limited me to this is kind of all I can talk about. That's where I felt like it limited me, and I really wanted to branch out of that. We're in the process of starting kind of a nonprofit based. There's a kind of a foundation that was some money that was left. My cousin miraculously had a life insurance policy, and part of that is we're going to start like a nonprofit with suicide prevention and really work on that. So those are the areas that I really would like to focus on with LinkedIn, is just getting that message out there. So that's. Do you have the 501c3 organized yet? No, not yet. That's kind of like we've decided between my aunt and us that we're going to that's the first of the year kind of project, and that's where we're headed.
We want to be unique and different. There's so many, I think of those preventions, not, suicide prevention, for example, there's lots of nonprofits out there, but our goal, I want to try to be unique and different and us approach it from a different way. And I want to get your thoughts on this. I had this thought last night, and I'm looking at this morning, I was doing kind of reading a devotional, and really what the devotional talked about is the summary of it is this: change the why to how. So like you might be like saying, why is my life the way it is? Or why is my career the way it is? Or why did this happen to me? Or why did my cousin die? Or why? And what this devotion was talking about is changing that why to how. In other words, how can I live? And I do believe it goes in track with some of the things you were saying. It's like, how can I live now that my cousin has committed suicide, that I've made this mistake, or that I've struggled in this area? Or in other words, it's how versus why. And I love that idea. And so part of it's just trying to think of unique ways to get people's attention about these subjects. I've had videos go viral on TikTok, and one of them was like a suicide prevention kind of TikTok, and other one was ranching stuff. I've had several, but part of it, it's like, the reason my suicide prevention, video went viral is because honestly, it was shock and awe. And it was part of my healing. So I took videos and pictures and then I put them out there, and they went viral, of course. And then after, this part of my grieving process, I think that I really was grieving, and almost like I wanted to shock the world, and that if you saw what I saw, then you would never commit suicide. But also after, being a year and a half away from that, then I realized that shock and awe is not the way that I necessarily want to go. I want to go to this idea that, more like we are, like I was saying earlier, undefeated. We're undefeated in the way that we approach life, and we need to, I don't know, just differently, more creative, I guess.
Do you have a pen?
Yep, somewhere. Yep, I got one.
Can you write down why, how?
Why, how?
Who? Okay,
why,
so
how,
you got
who?
your why, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got your why, you got your how.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you going to help with it?
Okay.
Who do you know that can help you with it?
Yeah.
Who do you know that can help you get the message out? Who do you know that will support it? Who do you know that will talk smack about it all day long and enjoy doing it?
Yeah.
Like positive smack. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because we get stuck in the whys and the hows. And it's important to know your why. It's important to know how, but it's also important to know who. The other thing I want you to write down is, you got it?
Yep.
B, do, have.
Okay. Be, do, have.
So example, you're an example of being a survivor. Mm-hmm. Now you're doing the work to help others so that you can have, I'm building here, so bear with me, so that you can have a foundation that alters and saves lives. And it doesn't just save lives, it helps them to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
Oh, yeah, that's good.
So use these, the act of being and doing to have, the act of knowing the why and knowing the how to helping the who.
That's great.
Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when it comes to LinkedIn, in short, on LinkedIn, it depends on what you're wanting to create. The one thing I will say about LinkedIn that applies to all platforms, but I notice it really applies to LinkedIn, is consistency is key.
Mm-hmm.
So however you're choosing to show up, or however often, if you're going to go on and do that, make sure that you're really consistent in it, because that consistency pays off. Okay. Right?
Yeah.
People get used to being there. There's also, I'd have to take a good solid look at your whole profile and what you're doing. But there's some visuals and hashtags and marketing stuff that I could probably come at you with and say, hey, tweak this here, here, and here, and you're going to get a little more traffic. Because it sounds like, and the reason why I chose the platforms I chose, by the way, when you ask, is because you seem like to me someone who is comfortable behind a mic, comfortable talking, comfortable with video. And so the the thing that I would say to you there is to lean into your strengths, right? So if you want to do something longer form, the lives are a good idea. If you want to catch people's attention, don't do a video over about 4 minutes. Yeah. Keep them short, because what happens is that the people want to participate, people want to listen, but most of them have a really short attention span. So you want to keep them real brief to kind of hook them, to bring them so that they go, oh, I like this guy's stuff. And then you offer live ever so often so that they have a chance to show up on that live. Make sense?
Yeah, it's great. By the way, genius. What you just did was genius. It really was. Because see, I've done a lot of consulting, a lot of business consulting. And I think that where I differ from most people is that I call it is prove your worth. I love it because, like, for example, I'm giving a quick example, but I would say, hey, I'm looking at, okay, maybe their problem is basically they're losing money. And so I say, hey, you can hire me. And this is how much we're going to increase in 6 months or whatever. This is what we're going to do. And I put my money where my mouth is. It's like, I can prove to you that we can do exactly what we're saying, or I wouldn't say it. Like, I believe that we can do this, and this is our goal, and this is what we're going to do. And if we don't, then I wouldn't say you don't owe me money, but close, because I love putting my money where my mouth is. It's like, I think we can do this, and here's how we're going to do it. And here's going to be the result. And I'm going to really prove this to you. And I'm going to prove my worth. And you're going to say, okay, in 6 months, I had an agreement with you or whatever. And in that 6 months, we did what we wanted to do. We accomplished what we wanted to do. Now we need to work on this other area, and I can help you do that too, and et cetera. And I think that most people do not prove their own worth. I really do. It's like, I want to see them prove what they're saying. And part of that, and you just did it, part of that is giving away their best information free. And that's not my concept. That actually comes from Gary Vaynerchuk. It's like, give away your best. Give it all away.
Give it all away, because what it comes down to, and I do that, give it all away, because what it comes down to is when people do purchase from me, they're purchasing the time with me to help them implement what I give them. That's really what it is, because the rest, I mean, you can find it if you're willing to do enough time and research. What I really do is save people time, because all that is there. I mean, if you go take a good quality marketing course, you're going to hear a lot of what I just said.
Yeah,
when you ask me, I go boom, 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 instead of you reading however many chapters. That's all.
Well, we actually talked about that recently too. We were talking about somebody who does bookkeeping. They own a company that does accounting and bookkeeping, and it's like, first of all, I have a degree in accounting, so I'm not a good example, but you could definitely go. You're smart enough. You could go take a course, and you could learn accounting. You could learn how to do QuickBooks online or whatever. But the bottom line is that the best use of your time? And the answer is, if you are in real estate, as an example, is that the best use of your time to learning how to do QuickBooks? And the answer is no. So pay someone to do those things for you, help you, and you concentrate on the things that you're great at and that you want to pursue, and blah, blah, blah. So I think when I think about your what you offer, that's the same concept. It's like, yes, I could read a bunch of self-help books. I could do this, business books, leadership books. But why, whenever I have somebody who can be an expert in that field and help me grow substantially, and I can also concentrate on the things that I'm good at too. So thank you so much. And I mean, super impressed for you guys listening. I mean, that was impressive. That fact that you actually gave away your information for free. You gave away some good advice. And so I respect that, and I love it. And so, Andrea, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. Very nice to meet you. I hope that in the future we can do more stuff together. Maybe it can be another podcast in the future. Maybe there's something that you're working on that I can help you with. I would love to do that. I guess basically I'm hoping that we stay in touch, and I'll continue following your stuff, and maybe you'll follow mine, and we'll see what happens. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Right.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Yes,
have a great day. It's very nice to meet you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Yep.
Thank you again for listening to I'm Fine, Save Me. If any part of this show resonated with you, share it with your community. Help others see that being vulnerable isn't being weak, but takes courage. Don't forget to subscribe and follow on your podcast app of choice so that you can get this show downloaded each Monday. And thank you again for listening.